Welcome everyone. This is the third iteration of the Global Epistemics webcast series, sponsored and organized by the Center for Global Knowledge Studies, impersonated by Inanna Hamati-Ataya, who is with us today as well, and Crash, the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Cambridge. My name is Felix. I will moderate this session, and I am also organizing it. We're trying to come up with an edited volume on the basis of these talks. So everyone, hi. The first two sessions, I think, were great successes, and the paper for this one is fascinating. So I'm really looking forward, Leo, to what you have to say. And just for everyone who didn't listen in just now, Leo is based in Warwick, although we can see that he's in fact in Italy. But he just defended his PhD actually at the University of Warwick in January 2020. His doctoral program was funded by the ESRC Doctoral Training Centre studentship, and his thesis was entitled Earth, Property, Territory, the Birth of an Economic Concept of Land. And this is also very much the topic of his talk today. We're talking about the epistemologies of land, and we have very different epistemologies throughout the webcast series. Today we're looking at economics, but through a lens of, well, I would say intellectual history, political theory. You can tell us whether that's true, Leo. And the talk's called Land as Capital, a genealogy through the birth and development of economic thought. So having said that, I'm looking forward to hear what you have to say, Leo. You have about 20 minutes, but we have enough time, so don't feel pressured, and everyone feel welcome to join the discussion afterwards. There is no strict format for that. We can just talk openly. So hi everyone, thanks for showing up, and Leo, your turn.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Felix, and for putting this all together, because I think it's really interesting, and I've certainly in my own academic experience so far missed a sort of forum like this to talk to other people who are interested in thinking about land from a more epistemological point of view. So I think it's a really interesting project. Yeah, so as Felix said, the paper I recirculated is based on my doctoral, well, it's based partly on my doctoral research, also on it's synthesizing different elements of my doctoral research and also combining some things I've been doing since. It's what I've tried to do. Have I approached the question of the land and epistemology? It struck me that the idea of land as capital is a dominant way of thinking about, indeed hegemonic way of thinking about land today. But from my own research, I could see that this is one which is certainly historically contingent and certainly subject to a process of development that I think is not totally self-evident. Now, I think it's worth saying that what I'm doing here is not talking about, not thinking as other literature has done about how land is progressively incorporated into circuits of capital, which is, of course, an important topic in its own right. And there's a good literature on the commodification of land, and that's very important ongoing process around the world today. But I thought there was some value in tracing the idea of land as capital from the perspective of theoretical economics, thinking about where those ideas actually come from. Okay. So yeah, what I want to do today is talk about the birth and development of economic thought and how land plays a key role in that. So the paper had three sections. The first deals with what I called some material discursive preconditions of economic knowledge, in which transformations in relations to land played this key role, I came to realize, in actually making economic thought possible in various ways. So I just wanted to say something about that. The second part is about theoretical precursors of economic knowledge. And again, really the centrality of land in the various discourses that are often seen as precursors of economics. And then finally, this is really broad in scope, but this is really just a survey of developments in 19th century economic theory, moving from the start of the century, where land and agricultural productivity was really a central topic of concern, towards the end of the 19th century, where the interest in land declined, and theoretically land was conflated with the concept of capital. Okay, I'll dive in then with the first section. So the preconditions of economic knowledge. So in the paper, I highlighted three crucial preconditions of economic knowledge. The first was the development of private property in land. This is a development that began in Britain. It began in England in the late 15th century, continuing all the way through to the early 20th century. And it overturns the earlier feudal system of dependent landholding, in which landholding was part of a whole political and social structure in which you would hold land of your feudal superior. It was important because it swept away a system in which the majority of individuals, or a majority of individuals, would have been working directly with the land, subsistence dwelling, and instituted a system of based on commercial agriculture. Now, accompanying the emergence of private property was a discourse on improvement. Private property came about legally and practically by processes of enclosure, which meant both legally assigning individual rights and physically enclosing the land with hedges, ditches, or walls, normally to keep sheep on. Very early on, it was recognized that there were important soil fertility benefits in stocking animals because they would manure the soil. And through the 17th and 18th century, a substantial literature developed on improvement, which had a variously practical and natural historical focus. But I think in terms of this genealogy, the key point is about the development of a discourse on land's productivity, which didn't exist before. So we've got private property improvement, and then we've got the development of statistical knowledge. The early modern period saw increasing efforts towards the quantification of various aspects of state territory. Important names here in Britain are people like William Petty, John Graunt, Gregory King. There are a lot of debates in the early modern period about population, where the concern was mainly about depopulation, because at the time population, I think, was predominantly thought of as part of the strength of a nation. So the fear was that there might be depopulation. But it seemed important to me that particularly going to the 18th century, prominent improvers people such as Arthur Young and John Sinclair were also prominent advocates of the need for better statistical knowledge. And the 18th century, into the early 19th century, saw the rise of the development of more modern techniques of surveying and of census. This first census was gathered in 1801. So gathering of kinds of quantified knowledge. And again, it played into this question of the productivity of land, because again, there was this question of relationship between population and available land area. Okay, so just moving on, the second section dealt with the theoretical precursors to economic theory through to Adam Smith, who is famously, though I would say somewhat misleadingly, credited as the founder of economic thought, which I won't go into now, but we can talk about that in the questions if you're interested. So I think in terms of political theory, John Locke's work is significant. It's kind of, in many ways, an embodiment of the context I was talking about private property and improvement. He famously grounded a theory of the legitimacy of government in the protection of private property and rights in land. And improvement played a key role in this argument. Locke said that that appropriating land individually didn't diminish, but increased what he called the common stock of mankind. In doing that, in putting forward that argument, he gave this kind of implicit utilitarian defense of property rights on grounds of improvement. So that's the first thing I want to mention here. The second, again, there are three, were debates around value and productivity. Again, people like William Petty are important here. Petty raised the problem of the commensurability of land and labour. How do we understand the different inputs to production in terms of the relative value of land as compared to labour input? Locke's work, Locke's two treatises represented one way out of this. They put forward what's often referred to as a protean theory, labour theory of value. Locke said that labour put the difference of value on everything. An alternative way out of it, probably less well known, was put forward by Richard Cantillon in what has been termed a land theory of value, which I think is super interesting. Thinking through questions of value in terms of how much land it required. So you could think through the value of a table or something by thinking through not only the value, the land required to produce the wood, but also the land required to produce the subsistence of the labourer for a given amount of time. And then the third element here was, theoretical element, was the Physiocrates. So shifting focus to France for a second, the Physiocrates in France, who are generally often credited with coming up with a theory of capital. So yeah, this is the first time we see capital. Capital here actually comes in strictly in distinction to land, as part of a diagnosis for France's lackluster agricultural development. Turgot said that the reason for France's relatively lackluster agricultural development in comparison to England was not a lack of good agricultural land, but a lack of capital. So a lack of the financial and other material resources needed to increase productivity. Very briefly, skimming over Adam Smith. Adam Smith is really a crucial figure, but I think he can be seen as kind of synthesizing these things together. His argument placed central importance on improvement, which he saw as the greatest of public advantages. a very interesting emphasis on man's ability to adapt the natural world, and soil fertility, the stocking of animals, soil fertility. That was again an important part of his argument, which I don't have time to talk about now, but again I can say a bit more about it if you want. But saw agriculture as the foundation of national wealth. Okay, so the third part of the chapter deals with, I called it after Smith, land as factor of production, land as capital. So in histories of economic thought, what's often called classical economics is the political economy that emerged around the turn of the 19th century. So going back to questions of population here, the intervention of Thomas Malthus is really important. Malthus is still famous for his pessimistic intervention. He kind of flipped the discourse on population from these early modern fears of depopulation towards a sudden fear at the start of the 19th century of overpopulation. And with, as I said, the birth of the national census in 1801 and subsequent censuses, people could actually see that the population was rising. So there was a kind of, I guess, a sort of epistemic confidence in this idea that indeed population does tend to grow, or at least is growing. Oh, sorry, I lost my place. But Malthus is not really the most important economist of the early 19th century. Ricardo, I think, in theoretical terms, really represents some of the important ways in which political economic ideas are taken forward. And he's very much, although he disagreed with Malthus on various points, he's very much a Malthusian in terms of thinking about land and population. He basically agreed entirely with Malthus on that. And one of his famous contributions was a theory, or credited with, he actually probably wasn't the first, but he's credited with the main statement of a theory of rent based around land scarcity. And his fear was that increasing population would progressively increase rents and eventually skew the distribution of wealth so that all the wealth flowed to landlords and profits of capital dipped to zero, and a stationary state was reached, is the fear of the early 19th century economists. So in terms of the argument here, again, we've got land and capital are strictly distinguished here. Land, labour and capital are the three factors of production. And the perspective is a territorial, a governmental, I would say, though we can open that up a bit as well, a perspective on questions of productivity, in which questions about land's productivity and population are central. Now, getting to the kind of crux of the end point of this genealogy, the idea of land as capital emerges only quite a bit later in the 19th century, after what's called the marginal revolution in economic theory. I think the essential point here, important figures are people like Jevons, Woolger, and Menger, who all, I think, in different ways, kind of came to this idea that actually maybe land could be thought of as a species of capital. But it was actually John Bates Clark, who's an American economist of the subsequent generation, who really put the argument forward most directly in answer to Henry George, the late 19th century land economist. But Clark's essential point was that as land was a scarce resource, capital was a scarce resource too. And land was not, for Clark, land wasn't natural in the way that the classical economists has insisted. So for Ricardo, rent was a payment for the natural fertility of the land. Clark wanted to say that there is no such thing as natural fertility, because even if land is just cleared, there's an element of labour. There's an element of human effort involved in that. There's a production of its fertility. But I think looking at contemporary agricultural practices, he rightly noted that the importance of artificial, well, not artificial fertilization, but fertilization by bringing in additional manure, and this idea of his idea was that the soil was a resource that had to be replenished through human effort as well. So through these, he also said that technology, like the railway, had eliminated difference of space, which kind of made, which previously had caused different bits of land to have different values. And so these are the kind of arguments that theoretically made land emerge as a part of a broader field of capital goods. And that's an orthodoxy that's kind of stayed with economics, and modern economics, as various critics have complained, doesn't treat land as a central object of theoretical interest. So that's the scope of the genealogy. Maybe just make a couple more points to finish if I've got a couple of extra minutes. So yeah, the key points I wanted to emphasize: relations to land played historically a key role in providing the epistemic foundations of economic knowledge as a whole, especially through the discourse and practice of private property in land, a discourse on land's productivity, and attempts to calculate the relationship between land area and population, as well as other aspects of territory. Yeah, and I wanted to just throw in that I think in Foucauldian terms, we can say this is a governmental perspective on land, and maybe I can say a bit more about that. Yeah, but it's interesting to me to note that it was from a consideration of agricultural productivity that a concept of capital, an economic concept of capital, emerged. And yet, through theoretical developments, the concepts of land and capital came to be conflated. The territorial framing is really a crucial part of economic knowledge as it emerged in the early 19th century, with this strict distinction of land and capital. And yeah, that territorial framing, I think, remains, but kind of very much falls into the background as land disappears as a sort of distinct concept within economic theory. In terms of why this happens, a bit more speculatively, I think Clark pointed to the rise of technologies of transportation, and increasing global trade in foodstuff. I think likely made calculations about land area and agricultural priority a less fundamental priority of this kind of perspective. The shift to a fossil metabolism also made land area and agricultural productivity a less fundamental consideration in terms of the energetic foundations of productivity. And finally, changing agricultural practice as well. Increasing use through the 20th century of artificial fertilization, I think has enhanced the sense in which land's productivity appears as something produced rather than something natural. So I've thrown out a ton of thoughts here, and I'll be really interested to hear what people make of it, what they find interesting, if anything. And yeah, thank you.